In this tutorial, we're going to look at how to achieve this effect. The animals are tracked using Lockdown, and their alpha channel was created by pulling keys with a composite brush or rotoscoping inside a Lockdown stabilized composition. I'm going to use the snail shot for this tutorial. Let's get started. In order to do this shot, we're just going to use a smaller section so the tutorial can be faster. I'll apply Lockdown to the shot, and then I'm going to find some points to track. I'm going to start with the shell and the body. These should be pretty easy and straightforward. So I'll control click. Those are my points. We can get started here. And I'm intentionally avoiding these antennas because I know they'll be a little bit difficult to track, and we'll get back to those a little bit later. I can press to track points. Let's take a look. For the most part, all of these tracking points are looking pretty good, but one of the most important parts in this process is removing any bad tracks. I can see one bad track right here, so I'll alt-click to delete it. And I can see another track jumping right here. This is okay through part of the shot, so one of the things you can do to still make use of this is at the jump, I'm just going to go to the last frame where it was good. I'll say about here it looks good. I'm going to delete backward keyframes. So this point is gone towards the beginning of the shot, but will still contribute nicely towards the end of the shot. I'm going to attempt to track the antennas in this track. And because these antennas are basically the same motion throughout from top to bottom, I feel like we probably only need to track at the top and at the end of each of them. One of the most important things we need to do is extend this mesh so it goes over the edges of the snail. That's on the shell and the body and also on the antenna. To very quickly demonstrate why we need to do that, I'm going to continue with the lockdown process. Moving into the comp and just putting on a sample texture. Tabbing back. We're going to need this texture to go over the edges of the shell, so that's why we're going to need to do some extensions here. I'm going to undo that and just go back to what I had. And when making extensions, it's probably easiest to break this up into separate points on separate layers that are grouped to part of the same object. So I'm going to break this up into 6 layers. Shell. Neck, I guess, which is whatever this thing is here. And then we'll do the antennas 1, 2, 3, and 4. So starting with the shell, I'm going to delete all the points that aren't part of the shell. I'm going to make sure Lockdown is selected, and then Alt-click and drag, and delete those points that aren't part of the shell. To create a mesh extension, make sure Interpolate Partial Tracks is on, and then outside the edges of the shell, you can hold down Control-Alt-Shift and click. And now these extension points are following along on the outside of the shell. Next, let's move on to the neck. I'm going to solo the neck layer, and I'm going to delete all the keyframes that do not belong to the neck and the head, holding Alt, clicking and dragging. Removing the antenna. Maybe before I do the extensions, I'll see if I can get away with just a few more points, because more points will lead to a smoother deformation. Control clicking to place these points. And I'll press to track points. And I only see a few points that aren't working. I'm going to take this point here. Find the last frame where it's on and delete forward keyframes. The rest will be interpolated by Interpolate Partial Tracks. And I believe I saw this one move as well. Sometimes it helps to click and select a point and make it yellow. That way you can watch it as it moves. I'll delete the backward keyframes. And you'll notice that these 2 points, when they're dark blue, that means they're being interpolated. And you'll notice they're already moving along pretty well because they're following with the other points. Now I'm going to do my mesh extensions by holding Control-Alt-Shift and placing these points just a little bit outside of the body. avoiding the shell and the antennas, which we'll deal with later. Those extensions are looking pretty good. So I really want to drive home the point of why we're breaking these off into separate layers, so I'm just going to do that now using the antenna. For example's sake, I'm going to delete all these points down here so you don't have as much to look at. And let's say I'm trying to use extension points on this antenna right here. If I hold down Control, Alt, Shift, and click, and try to stay relatively tight, and we have interpolate partial tracks on, that actually doesn't look too bad, but you're going to notice that this point is probably being influenced by these points down here, and this point is probably being influenced by this point over here. So these points aren't really moving how we want them to with the main object. So when I take these points that aren't contributing to this antenna here, I'll just shift select them, and I'm going to alt click to delete them. I can turn off interpolate partial tracks, and then turn it back on, and you'll notice that at least here, this one is following much better at the top. However, these two down bottom might need a few extra points tracked in order to follow the antenna better. So I can do that. Actually, I'll go to this last frame, and I'm going to Control click here to create tracking points. I'll try one here, and there might be some detail in the middle of this antenna. We can try to track it and see what happens. I'd say these points in the extensions are mostly working. There's not going to be a lot of detail at the top, so I think it's okay that this point up here is kind of not rotating with the antenna as much. I will add just one more extension point here, and that will help get us the coverage that we need. I'm just going to time-lapse through antenna 2, 3, and 4 because the process is exactly the same and you don't need to see it. The second antenna is done. I'll skip over antennas 3 and 4. Next, we want to take all of these points from these separate layers and bring them back to our main layer. On our shell layer, let's select all points and then externalize the selected points. The reason we did our mesh extensions on separate layers is so the interpolation would only follow the points on those layers. The good news is this will work automatically because when points are externalized and then copied and pasted, the tracks are baked down into permanent keyframes and will no longer be influenced by other points. They simply are completed tracks. So to bake these all down, all you have to do is copy them. And in this copy data, they're just regular keyframes because it's actually the lockdown effect that knows which ones were interpolated and which ones aren't. The interpolation info doesn't go along with the copy and paste. And just to kind of show that, when I paste these keyframes, they look like any other keyframe tracks, just having the frame data for each point in the X and the Y pixels. Select the first externalized point on my main track and paste. And that will paste all of them. And now the interpolation data has not followed over to this main instance. And these won't be moved when we go in and paste in the other tracks from the other layers. I would actually probably just hide this and make this shy, because you never know if you have to come back to it. I'm going to select all the points on this lockdown instance, and by the way, they're not showing up right now. That's a bug in Lockdown 1.3. We will patch that out pretty quickly, but the points are there. If you go to select all points, you can see that these will render properly. As soon as you've selected them, it refreshes the render. We will fix that very soon. Then you can internalize these selected points, which clears out the externalized points keyframe tracks for the next layers to be pasted in. One thing you can do is just make a keyframe there, and then when you press U, it'll show that point 1. So going to this neck layer, select all, externalize, copy, and paste. Now moving back to my main instance, select all points, internalize, and these points are on the same layer, and they each have their extended mesh points without interfering with the other one's extended mesh points. So I'm just going to do that very quickly with antenna 1, 2, 3, and 4. We're tracked, and now comes the fun part. Let's create a mesh. So let's choose a frame that we think would be good to project our texture onto. I think this is a good frame because you can see some of the snail's face. I'm going to auto-triangulate the mesh, and just out of curiosity, I'm going to play this and look to see how the mesh is following. For the most part, it looks very good, except the only real glaring error I can see is on the first antenna. It looks like the triangulation was bad. So we can delete these edges by alt-clicking them. And we can click this point and Control-Shift-Click and connect these points, which feels a little bit more logical in terms of how that mesh will deform. I cut it out of the tutorial for time purposes, but I just went through and deleted some more of these edge connections that aren't going to be necessary. In my original project file, because this antenna crosses over the back of the neck here, and because this antenna and this antenna cross over the face, you're going to see an issue when it stabilizes. I'll press Apply Mesh on this frame, where because those areas cross over each other, the back of the snail's neck is moving past the antenna. And I'll just unapply the mesh, and you can basically see what's happening is that as this point and this point are moving over the back of the neck, they're moving it. So the way that you really would probably want to do this is I had it in layers just a moment ago, and I would have the face, which would consist of the antenna and the face on one layer where that's in the foreground, and then I would have another layer of the neck behind that and just composite it in a more typical sense. But for simplicity of this tutorial, and since none of you are using this exact shot, we're just going to move forward with that little bit of slip and say that you can refer to my previous shot for if you wanted to be a perfectionist about it. And this time, I'm ready to hit the lockdown button. Let's move into this stabilized comp. We want to apply texture to this whole snail, and the first step is probably just to do a little bit of roto and keying. Now, because we're stabilized, this roto is going to be relatively painless. And on this keyframe track, I'm just going to go to the end of the shot and see how this might have slipped a little bit. Again, this won't be slipping on the body, so right here, this will be very locked down because there are points. However, you might be getting a little bit of slip over the mesh extensions, and that's why we have to roto this edge, since we didn't track directly on the edge. We probably could have if there wasn't this other snail in the background getting in the way and being annoying. But anyway, because it's mostly stabilized, this is really probably the easiest roto you're ever going to do. And you can use Lockdown to apply masks very easily to any of your composites. Change this color so I can see it. I'd say this has been rotoed pretty well. I'm going to test this and see how it looks in the outer comp. I'm going to create a new solid and add some fractal noise here, and I'll use the mask above it as an alpha matte. In some ways this can be helpful because now I can see if I'm really rotoing tight to the edge or not. And honestly, we can probably just get away with a little bit of feathering. I'm going to set this to 4 pixels. That will likely do the job. And I'll solo this fractal noise layer. Moving back out, that's applied to the shell. I'm going to add some contrast, just temporarily. And I'll set the transfer mode to hard light. And I'll play this, and you can see that this is tracking the shell pretty well. I'll remove that contrast. And I don't need this fractal noise layer. And over on this side, I can probably get away with a key. I'm going to take my stabilized lockdown layer and pre-compose it, moving all attributes into the new comp. I'll go to Effect, Vranos, Composite Brush, and I'm going to attempt to key out this green here in the background. Alt-clicking on the parts of the snail that I want to keep. That's working pretty well. I'm just going to play that and see what's happening there. Well, it looks like where the rest of the snail is moving behind him, that's a problem. However, here to here, this is all looking very good. So I'll duplicate this layer, and I'll just have the background layer. And then I'll just call this Antenna roto. I'm going to be really embarrassed if these aren't antenna and if they're eyes or something. And this whole time I've just been referring to it wrong. But that's okay. And my general strategy here is that I don't want to add in anything that I don't want. So over here, that's where that other snail is coming in through the background. I'll just go like that. Shell over here probably isn't a problem. I'm going to feather this a little bit. And I'm going to add a matte blur for a composite brush. Maybe 1 pixel would probably do it. So we have this shell mask, which we hand rotoed, and then we have the antenna key. Between the two of these, this makes an alpha mask. And again, if we want to double check this, I'm actually going to use a different trick this time. I'll put this fractal noise over the top with the preserve underlying transparency transfer mode. I'll hide that reference. So now this is treating these 2 layers beneath it as a mask. And you can see how well this is tracking on all of these pieces as one texture. Except for right there, but again, if you have a shot like this, just break it up into separate layers. I don't want to spend all day on roto, so I'm just going to loosely mask in parts of the face and the lower antenna. Now let's actually get to adding this rainbow texture. This is the texture I used. I actually just got this from some stock website. And I put on a little bit of a color correct to it just to dull those purples. And then I have a waves layer here, which is using the radio waves effect. And that's just animating outward, acting as an alpha mask. And I have an adjustment layer, which is using that. And all that's doing is brightening this up. So that's how simple the animation is. Looking back at my original background, I'm just going to make this a guide layer. I'll drop my rainbow layer in. And cover the snail. And I'll set the transfer mode to preserve underlying transparency. So it's using this all beneath as a mask. And for this layer, I probably want to feather this quite a bit. I'll set this to subtract. And I'll guess 100 something pixels. Let's take a look. I'll set this to overlay. And you can already start to see this shot coming together. One thing that's helpful is to lock this comp. And then when you work inside of the stabilize comp, you can see how your changes are applying. I'm going to very quickly roto the side of the face on time lapse. That's looking much better. And you'll notice that parts of the shell should be way more out of focus. I'll just look at this stabilized. Over here, this definitely needs to be out of focus. And the easy way to do this, again, is inside this stabilized pre-comp. I'm just going to use fast bokeh. Thanks, Satya, for giving me a license of this. You can actually create a depth map for this, but because this is so easy, I'm just going to be lazy with it. And I'm just going to refer back to my background and see what else looks like it might be a little bit out of focus. In general, most of it looks sharp except the top of this antenna here. I'll just make another adjustment layer. Also with fast bokeh. Again, this is not the most scientific application method, but because this is stabilized, this is just so easy to do. And I feel like this whole animated rainbow layer needs to be blurred just a little bit. By the way, let's see what this looks like animated. Here's what it looks like stabilized. To finalize the look, it was basically just color correction and glow. I cooled it off significantly. I desaturated the background. And I darkened it a lot. I'm not going to match exactly what I did, but this is kind of just for example's sake. And then I threw an adjustment layer over it and used deep glow. I set the threshold to about 80-ish, and that kind of got it so we were just glowing really, really heavy over that animated wave. And took down the exposure just a bit. And there you have it. So again, the main difference between the tutorial you just saw and the actual shot that I did was I spent a little bit more time layering things out. But these are the basic concepts that you can apply to any shot of your own. Here's the final. Thanks for watching. For more info, check out aescripts.com/lockdown.